Hello everyone, welcome to SwitchUp. In today's video we're going to have a look at one of the worst performing games released for the Switch 1, the original Switch 1, that being Deadly Premonition 2.
Yeah, we saw so many comments of people just saying, please revisit it. It was such a state, but I wanted to play it. So yeah, we thought we'd give it a quick look.
So we're playing it on the Switch 2 this time round to see if playing it that way brings any sort of improvement to performance. Does it do so? Well, let's find out. So the Deadly Premonition series, as it is, there are two games of course, started back in 2010 with the release of that first game on the Xbox 360, and it's a series that, depending on who you speak to, people either love it or hate it. You know, it's that sort of game, but it has had a bit of a cult following since that release back in 2010. In fact, I read earlier that it's in the Guinness Book of Records for being the most critically polarizing survival horror game ever released.
Yeah, I could kind of see that from what I've seen. Deadly Premonition Origins is also on Switch, isn't it?
That's the re-release of that first game. So yeah, that's the first game that released on the Switch with a slightly new title. And then in 2020, so some 10 years later, they released the sequel, the long awaited by some people, sequel Deadly Premonition 2. Now, when it's first released on the Switch, I'm not talking about the game itself, the story and whatnot. I'm sure there's lots to say about that too. But just in terms of performance, it's fair to say it ran pretty atrociously when it first came out.
Absolutely. It was running like 7 to 10 frames per second at times. Like, it was an absolute state, wasn't it?
It was a bit of a disaster. I remember starting this game when it first released, and I remember just struggling to the point that it was going to ruin my love for these games. So I just binned it off, left it, and haven't played it since. Now, in terms of Switch 1, before we move on to Switch 2, that game is currently up to version 1.0.4 if you're playing it on the Switch 1 these days. So it's obviously had a few patches since release. And what you'll find these days if you're playing it is a frame rate that seems to steady out at about 23-24 frames per second, but can fluctuate quite wildly either way.
Yeah, we didn't realize that this was uncapped when we first played on Switch 1. You just would never know because it doesn't really go above 30 when you're on the exterior locations, but it is uncapped on both versions. And as Glenn says, when you're on the skateboard around 23 frames per second, when you're walking around on foot at his ludicrously slow pace, it can hit more like 27, 28, and you can see the interiors are slightly above that as well, as it does have that uncapped frame rate. Definitely a big improvement over the initial release if you were considering checking it out on Switch 1.
Yeah, the patches have definitely made this playable on the Switch 1 now, because it was at a point where, as that word gets bandied about a lot, it was literally unplayable. It was so bad, it was almost slideshow material. Let's look at the visual quality of the game then, as it first was on the Switch 1. It went for a cartoonish look, almost looked cel shaded at times, but there were a lot of issues with the visual fidelity when playing on the Switch 1.
Yeah, the level of detail draw distance is very close to the player, so you will see geometry materializing from its very basic form to fully fledged cars. People will pop in and out of existence. It's a right state.
It really is. You'll see the cross-hatching on the trees. You'll see those again materialize right before your eyes. And this is, we're talking about version 1.0.4. We're not going way back to its initial release here.
Visual quality is definitely an improvement over the initial footage that we've seen, but still it does have a number of issues. Aliasing from a lower resolution than native, and an interesting effect on the textures of the game. So as you're moving down the road on the skateboard, there's a very unusual squarish cross-hatching that's happening in the distance. I don't know what that is. I've never seen that before. Very strange.
Add to that the stutters that are very frequent. Again, we're talking about the most recent patched version 2, which do cause those wild fluctuations in frame rate. And then we haven't even mentioned frame pacing, which again is just all over the place.
It's a real mess. Some of those frame drops amount to around about 1/5 of a second. So it's not that you notice them, they like hit you in the face. It's pretty bad.
Also, you have the load times. When you first load the game up, I'll show you the screen here. This you have the picture of the tree with the leaves falling, and you'll notice this kind of stuttering at times itself, just the load screen, sorry. You're looking at 49 seconds to get into the game.
Yeah, you certainly get well acquainted with that screen, that's for sure.
You do.
When you're moving over to handheld, once again, the OLED really does come through as the hero of Switch 1. The quality of the screen is so good that it can actually hide a lot of the issues. Some of the stutters and things don't seem quite as bad here. That's probably relating to the fact it's running at a lower resolution, and maybe it just smooths things out a little.
Yeah, and it does make the game easier to play, because when you're turning the camera, say for example, whereas on the big screen it is quite nauseating at times, you just don't seem to notice it as much, or at least I didn't when playing on the smaller screen.
Which then takes us over to the Nintendo Switch 2, and this is where straight away you realise that, yeah, actually this game's uncapped.
Yeah, absolutely. So as soon as you start to move around, you'll notice a much smoother experience, with the frame rate again being quite erratic, but settling down at times to about 45, give or take.
Absolutely. We've had a lot of Nintendo Switch 2 releases that hover around 45. Kinitsugami, its frame rate is basically 40 to 45, and that's more than playable. Here you can see 45 up to 60 at times. When we move over to interior locations, it's more of a solid 60.
It is a solid 60 indoors from the areas we visited at least. It's quite interesting because the drops or the fluctuations between say 45 and 60 are so wild that if you're swerving on your skateboard, if you watch the frame rate counter, you'll see it's almost like a wave hitting 60, dropping down for every swerve you make on that skateboard. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
And every breath you take.
Exactly right. Yeah. Not creepy at all.
No, it's fine. Interestingly, when I looked at this one on Switch 2, my brain told me that the image quality was significantly better. The Switch 2 does seem to handle its lighting more in a different way, so the colours are slightly different. It seems to be a little darker on my one. I don't know if it's the same on yours, Glenn, but then as well, that's reflected in the handheld. Image quality isn't that much different, is it?
No, in terms of resolution, it's still pretty much the same. Mark mentioned the shadows there, and that's a big part of where you'll see an improvement in the Switch 2. Interestingly, because this is a game where you have an in-game clock, if you'll notice the footage on the screen now, you'll see it's the same time of day in both games, and you'll see how much darker the shadows are on the Switch 1. They're just not as refined, not quite as nuanced, whereas when you look on the Switch 2 for the exact same place, same time of day, you'll see they're just handled a bit better, which does help with some of the resolution issue.
Yeah, I wondered if that was related to the HDR of the Switch 2. So obviously the high dynamic range means that things like light and dark, you can tend to see more detail within those areas. This obviously isn't a HDR game, but it's potentially forced on in the menu, which you can do.
Yeah, it just helps with the overall aesthetic. You see here driving through these cornfields. Again, if you look at the shadows on the Switch 1, they're very dark. They just look like blobs, basically. When you move over to the Switch 2, I'm not saying that they're massively improved, but just that more nuanced lighting does help to just keep things a bit easier on the eye.
And you can tell that Glenn and I are not skateboarders when we call it driving.
I had a skateboard once for about 10 minutes.
I drove it into a wall, mate.
Yeah, 1990 it was. Good times. If we finish by looking at the Switch 2 in handheld mode, again a very similar story in terms of that higher frame rate. Certainly easier to play than the Switch 1 counterpart, but not much difference between its Switch 2 docked version, if that makes sense. There's more of an improvement from Switch 1 handheld to Switch 1 docked than there is in Switch 2.
Also, the Switch 2 once again shows me that it has that blue hue, which I really don't like. It makes things that should be kind of a, I don't know, a natural, almost sandy colour look blue.
Okay, so obviously I'm colourblind, so I haven't really picked up on that, but that's interesting to note, yeah. So to summarise, I mean, there are a few summaries to be had here. You have how the game now plays on the Switch 1 compared to when it released. If you're someone that perhaps wanted it back then and just was put off by the negative press, it certainly runs better now. If the Switch 1 is your only way of playing it, it's almost a game these days, which is nice. But if you do have the game but also have the Switch 2 and are able to play it on there instead, there's a stark improvement in terms of that frame rate. Not so much in terms of things like resolution. It's a better way to play on the Switch 2 for sure, but at least now it is in some sort of playable state on the Switch 1, albeit still not the best.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think Switch 2, if I was to play it like that, I'd be okay.
Yeah.
Switch 1 as it is now, it would be a push. If it was like a super deep discount, maybe, but like you say, definitely Switch 2 is the way now if you've got that option.
Absolutely. Again, as we always say with this series, do let us know of any games that you would like to see us visit, and we'll do our best to do so. Sometimes we put them into a multi-game video, but we felt this one needed its own video because there was so much to say.
Sure. Thank you to our Patreons and members. If you'd like to save yourself a bit of bunts over on your eShop credit or anything like that, we've got a load of links down in the description to various bits and bobs. And yeah, thank you to our Patreons and members, all of you that enjoy the content.
Take care and happy gaming.